Okay, cool. I hope the audio is now clear for the Zoom people and I am audible here as well. So today is session 6 of the Getting Started with Machine Learning series. What we have discussed so far has been more about supervised learning and learning with labeled training data set. You remember the way we talked about classifying something as cat or dog or spam or no spam. But what if we have a scenario wherein that data is not labeled at all? We just have an entire huge corpus which has XYZ number of images, and we don't know what is a cat, what is a dog, or whatsoever another animal. So that class of machine learning, when we deal with such unlabeled data set, is called unsupervised learning. The two main algorithms that we study under unsupervised learning are k-means clustering and dimensionality reduction. We'll basically discuss both of these in detail today. But before getting into any of those algorithms, let's just first understand this shift that we have done from understanding through a training mindset with a labeled data set to an unlabeled data set. So what is happening here is, let's take an analogy. Let's say I give you like a massive bin of Legos and I ask you to build something out of it. Now, you don't know what are the different classifications of different Lego pieces that I have given you. So, what will be your first reflexive approach to it? You'll start segregating them. You'll segregate them into colors of green on one side, red on another, let's say blue on another side, and then I have rectangles on one side, squares on another. So, this is the way that we are kind of figuring out our own way without having preset groups of the Lego blocks. So what is happening here is that I gave you the massive bin, and now you yourself figured out how to make this beautiful piece out of Lego yourself without me giving you the preset classification. That is entirely what unsupervised learning is. The data is unlabeled, and the algorithm figures itself out how to find the underlying patterns and makes groups out of it, and puts all of it together to kind of build something sort of in this fashion as we're talking about Lego in this particular case. So to formally define unsupervised learning is a class of machine learning algorithm wherein we use unlabeled data set and we cluster and analyze those data sets to find underlying meaning and patterns that help us determine something, which is end goal of the entire analysis that we are doing. And I have highlighted this here in the last line, if you can see, these algorithms, they discover hidden patterns or data groupings without the need of human intervention. So we are channelizing the algorithm to train on the data and figure out itself the hidden lying patterns and clustering them or reducing their dimensions, which is something that we're going to discuss in a bit. Now, to understand this classification, let's just understand this distinction first. What we were looking at till now in the previous 4 sessions was to predict a label. As I said, cat or dog or any other animal. So we started off with the notion of predicting a label. But what we are doing now in unsupervised learning is to infer the natural structure of the data. And how do we do it? We do it by different algorithms, which in a way or another ask questions to the data set. And how do these questions look like? They somewhat look like what hidden groups exist in my customer base. When I'm talking about, let's say, a data set related to an e-commerce platform, or it could even be I have different attributes for my data, but what are the most fundamental characteristics that kind of entirely depict the essence of the data that I have at hand? So there's a shift from predicting the label to inferring the natural structure. And in the process, we have all these different questions that we ask through the means of the algorithms. Where is this exactly applied? Now, data is huge out there. We have loads and loads of data, but there's also a huge sector of unlabeled data out there. And we particularly utilized unsupervised learning and unlabeled data for these domains. And it is not just this, it goes beyond that. But I just put together some examples for you to have like a better relation. Customer segmentation is one such domain. I have data about my e-commerce sales, and I just want to figure out how my customers' buying patterns kind of uh, project as and when the season changes, or as and when the sale season comes into the picture. How does that look? That is all that happens in customer segmentation. Fraud detection is another field. In the banking industry, fraud detection is something that actually massively forms the core of the volatile finance field. And finance field, I think for fraud does not happen naturally. It is kind of a fundamental shift from what usually happens, right? And that is entirely where these unsupervised learning algorithms put are put into the picture, and they decide if the particular action or activity that has been taken is a fraud or not, and groups them together. Next up is market-based analysis. Let's say we could portray this as, let's just depict a case of a supermarket. A person who buys bread and butter, what is the tendency that the person also buys fruits along with it, or that person also buys eggs along with it? That is something that goes under the market-based analysis. And then we obviously do have the medical diagnosis field, wherein we utilize patient data to kind of analyze the and kind of take out the hidden patterns that are lying for the medical diagnosis. So the goals for today, as I said, we're going to be discussing two main unsupervised learning algorithms. One is clustering. The name itself is self-explanatory. What we do here is that we automatically group together the similar data points. And the second goal is to talk about dimensionality reduction and its subsets. What is dimensionality reduction? It is a simple process of reducing the number of variables out there. Let's say if I am analyzing some goal out there and it has 50 features, but out of those 50 features or different attributes, only 20 hold certain value. I might as well just pick those 20 and drive my entire analysis in that direction rather than having those 50 put into the play. And why we do that, we're going to discuss it in a bit. So let's start with clustering with k-means. I just have two pictures here for you. Look at this picture first. We have some data points on the graph. And with the naked eye, I can see there are certain sort of clusters out there already. But I can't always go with the naked eye assumption, right? And this is a very small subset of data that we are looking at. So what happens is that this k-means algorithm is going to run at the back end, and it is going to give me a picture somewhat like this, wherein I have different groups of certain data points that are tending towards one particular direction. And this is the goal of k-means clustering. And when I say k-means, the k in the k-means is actually the number of clusters that you want to find. How do we find it? What is the right number of clusters? All these questions might be popping up now. And I think we have something or the other out there for each of these questions, which I'm going to discuss now. But before anything else, let's just understand how this shift from the graph on the right side, which is before k-means, to the graph on the left side, which has clusters already, is happening computationally. So we have this algorithm. It is also called the Lloyd's algorithm. How does it work is that we initialize by placing k centroids randomly, and it is kind of the assumption of k in the data space. Then what happens is that we assign each data point to its nearest centroid. So I laid, let's say, 3 different centroids. Now, if I have 30 different data points in the cluster, in the entire space, I'm going to assign each of those 30 different data points to the 3 clusters that I have determined. Next step is update. I assigned the cluster to each data point, but is it an efficient choice? Was the cluster that was assigned to a particular data point efficient enough computationally and whatsoever? That is entirely why we have this update point. So we recalculate the position of each centroid by taking the mean of all the data points that are assigned to it. And once that is done, if we see any iterations, we repeat the process entirely until and unless we do not have any centroids that are moving significantly. Now, there are 3 different aspects that we are seeing here, which is we want to assign nearest centroid to each data point. How does that happen? We want to recalculate. How does that happen? That happens in this way. So you see here how we have different clusters, right? How did we assign each centroid to each data point is through distinct distance metrics. And 2 very common distance metrics that we have are Euclidean distance and Manhattan distance. Now, Euclidean distance is something that you must have seen in the previous sessions as well. It is basically the straight line distance that is there between the points and the centroids. And it is very popular when we use it under the unsupervised learning algorithms. And the next is Manhattan distance, which is the sum of the absolute difference between the centroid and the data points. So these distance metrics are utilized to assign centroids to each data point that are out there in the space that we're talking about. What are the 2 basic goals in clustering? We had distance metrics, we had the entire Lloyd's algorithm placed into the picture. But what are we working for? What is the entire goal? How do we see if this is performing well or no? We do it by 2 simple goals, which is first to maximize the inter-cluster distance. That is, 2 clusters or whatsoever, any 8 clusters should be maximum distance apart so that we have distinct boundaries to the clusters. We know that the clusters that are made are compact enough to be far apart from any adjacent cluster that are out there. And the second goal that I said is minimize the intra-cluster distance. That is, within a same cluster, the points should be so tightly and compactly packed so that it heavily depend on the centroid that we are assigning to them and are close enough to it. That is how we ensure that the k-means algorithm is running efficiently. And that are the 2 goals that we work towards in k-means clustering. Now, how do we attain this? We attain this by the objective function, which is sometimes also called inertia. It is the within clusters sum of square function, WCSS. It is simple mathematical function, which is the sum of the square distances between each point and the center of its assigned cluster. And we are working towards minimizing this WCSS. So a simple formula out there. And what is determined by a smaller WCSS? Does anyone of you want to take a guess? Yep.
Low intra-cluster distance.
So smaller WCSS is equivalent to that the clusters are kind of very compact and whatever we have assigned as centroids is working well for the data that we are working with. That is entirely the objective function that we work towards. Now, I know I have a function as the distance metric. I have a function to determine the intra-cluster distance, but we started off with 30 data points and 3 clusters. How does that k is equals to 3 came into the picture? And that is where the elbow method comes into the picture. I can run my entire k-means algorithm for, let's say, 10 distinct values. But how do I know that one out of those 10 distinct value, which one is the best value? And that is determined by the elbow method. How does that elbow method happen is that we talked about the Lloyd's algorithm wherein we do initialization, assignment, then we update it to the clusters, and then we repeat that process over and over again. We run that process for different values of k. Let's say k is equals to 1, 2, and then we project up till 10. Then we calculate the WCSS for each. We looked at the formula of WCSS. It comes out as the entire objective function of 1k means iteration. We calculate WCSS for each iteration and see how compact the clusters are in each iteration. Then we plot it. We plot a simple graph against K, which are the number of clusters, against the WCSS that we have found. And then we find the elbow. What is actually the elbow? It's the point that suggests us the optimal number of clusters. And it is also the point that how do we get the optimal number of clusters when the entire dipping kind of diminishes in value. So here is an example. Let's say I have ran k-means clustering for a data, and I jot down the value of WCSS for different values of k, and I plotted it against this k versus WCSS graph. And if you see right here, there's a sharp elbow at k is equals to 5. That is, after that point, the reduction has kind of diminished. There's not much step down there. That is entirely the elbow point. And once we are done running the entire Lloyd's algorithm, we run this elbow method algorithm and then plot this graph against K versus WCSS to find the elbow, which is the optimal number of clusters out there. Now, what does K is equals to 5 mean here is that for this particular data, whatsoever data that we're talking about, for K is equals to 5, the distance between each two distinct clusters are the maximum, and the distance within each cluster is the minimum. That is, the clusters are compact enough. That is how we interpret this. So we looked at how k-means clustering algorithm works, how the elbow method works. And I think let's just start to code this by ourselves. Do all of you have Discord, AIS Discord? Are you guys member of it? Okay. I'll just share the code notebook there. The website. Done. Okay, I think now you guys will be able to access it. Just go to, instead of Discord, just go to ais-asu.com. I'll just open with you here. Yeah. And just go to events. And you'll find the collab notebook template here. This is the notebook that we're going to utilize right now. Just make sure that you make a copy of this and work in your drive on that. Let me know when you're good to go. Do all of you have access to the notebook now? Okay. Cool. Okay. So as a part of this coding exercise that I've put together here, we have two different ways of implementing k-means. One is by extreme scratch, by defining the functions and just running that entire algorithm by hard coding it. And the other means is by using another library, which is sklearn, which has functionality for k-means. So we're going to look at both of these possibilities right now. Um, but primarily, let's start by using it from scratch and building it. Just make a copy of this notebook and then we can start coding together. Okay, so in the code that you must see, this is a templatized code. A lot of things have already been coded for you, and the only places that require your attention are the core logic of k-means or whatsoever algorithm that we're going to talk about today. At instances wherein you have to kind of put your code, we have put together this symbol, which is any variable is equals to question mark. I'll just zoom this for you guys and let me know when's the. Does this look good for everybody out here? Okay. Okay. So just starting off with k-means from scratch, what I'm basically doing is I am defining a k-means function and I am conducting all those 4 steps that we talked about in the Lloyd's algorithm here. And then we're going to look at the plotting of elbow method and whatsoever. So I have a function. I have X as the data. I have N samples and N features, rows and columns. And then I have the K that is specified. So I can test for different number of Ks. And then I have a max iteration count here that I don't want for any iteration the max count to go beyond 300 because that just gets too much. Something here is TOL, which is convergence tolerance. So we don't want it to be a very high number because then the algorithm is particularly not working well. And we don't even want it to be a very small number because then it will just be working towards that perfection. So this is kind of a sweet spot that we have defined here. And what it is basically doing is it is working towards the convergence optimization for the centered allocation that we're doing. And then random state is equals to none. Now, what is happening here is that we first start off by initializing the centroids by picking k distinct random points. How do we do that? We do it by defining the instances or the indices. I want you guys to code with me here. So you see here the random thing that we are generating by the random function through NumPy. What we're going to basically do is we're going to take this and we're going to run a choice function for it for the n samples that we have. Yeah, for the n samples that we have. And then let's say the size is equals to k. And then there's another attribute called replace here, which is false. Now, given these indices, we want to initialize the centroids out there. How do we initialize these centroids? Is that for the data that we have, we'll simply write indices. And we'll just make a copy. This was the first step that we did as we discussed in the Lloyd's algorithm. Next step is to assign those data points to the clusters. How do we do that? We just calculate the normal distances out there. You remember the distance metric that we were talking about while we were working out on that algorithm. This is the distance assignment that we are doing. And then finally, we come up with the labels. What we want to do is we want to have the minimum of the distance, right? So we'll just simply have the labels assigned as the minimum values of those distances. And then we'll write distances here. No, that's equals to 1. Next step is going to be updation. We did the initialization, we did the assignment. Now we want to update it for the best possible way. And that is entirely what this snippet here is doing. So it just kind of works out to see what is the best possible cluster for a particular data point that we have assigned. And then we see the convergence. we just check the shift in terms of, yeah, in terms of the normal. And then we see the shift. How we see the shift? We see the shift as new centroids and the difference between the previous one. So just simply write new centroids. Now, given this, once all of this is done, we need the final allocation, right? So the final allocation happens through these snippets that I have here. I have the distances, I have the labels, and I want to specify the inertia now. If you remember, inertia is the WCSS that we were talking about, the within cluster sum of square function. So we basically define that as the sum of the distances that we were talking about, right? So you could write the inertia as called the numpy and then write sum. Then we take the sample. Then we take the labels and the centroids. And then just square it. Run that cell, make sure that you're also running the importing libraries before it. Okay, once this is done, we are looking at an elbow inertia function. Uh, you remember the elbow method that we were talking about? So this is basically a representation of that function. What we are basically looking at is the inertias for the particular k, which is the particular WCSS for any attached value of k. That is predefined. We don't have to work anything here, but just make sure that the entire concept behind the elbow is clear here. And then we want to plot the elbow graph, which is K versus the WCSS. So I'll just simply run these two cells, and that is similar to what you guys have to do as well. So the base work for defining the K-means is done. Now we want to put it to a data. And I believe that you guys might have worked on the iris data set in the past within these sessions. So we had this library here through which we loaded the iris data set. What is going to happen is that we're going to load that data set, utilize that entire data set to work out the k-means clustering algorithm for it. So I just simply load that data, ensure what are the feature names as, and then I want to run it. I want the k-means clustering algorithm to run. And what are the values that I'm going to look at? I'm going to see k minimum is equals to 1, which is that at minimum, the entire data space can have only one cluster, which is not a good scenario, but we need to have the baseline set right. And then we want the k max as 10, which is like the entire data scope, the max number of clusters. It should not go beyond 10 because then it will be like a super messy situation given the scope of data that we're talking about. And then similarly, we have max iteration and tolerance as said, and we have talked about this previously. And then random state is set as a seed number so that we preserve for application and reproduction. If I simply run this cell out there, which is something similar for you guys, you can see an elbow at 3, right? But here, I wouldn't go by this only result, right? Because I am actually hard coding the value 3 here. how do I know out of all these values of k 1 to 10, why did I come up with the value 3? The key k is equals to 3 is a classic choice that we take up for any data set. That is why I had a dummy here for you guys. But let's say we have this particular scenario for k is equals to 3 and we plot a graph for it. So this is something looking like this, that we have 3 distinct clusters. We have the red process as the centroids in the center. And then we can also have it run for like k is equals to 1 to 10 different values and then see which is the best particular value for any set data that we are looking at. Is everybody good till now? Yeah. What is the error? You have utilized capital X at multiple places. Just check if that's the error. Anybody else is having issues? Yes.
Yeah, I also.
I think he can help you with that. How many of you are done with this till now? Okay. Okay. Good. Okay, so what we looked at right now was to implement it by scratch. However, we have a functionality in the sklearn library so that what we can do is we can just simply call the k-means module out there. We can just simply call that functionality out there and it'll do the job for us. We don't have to specify all these backend functions in terms of assigning and then updating and then reassigning and then repeating that. All of that is taken care by just one simple call that you do with the code. So how does that happen? For that, we just simply have two additions here. Just run this code out there in terms of having the k-means that is imported and the standard scalar that is imported. Why we need the standard scalar, I'll tell you in a bit, but let's just start going through this. Here again, if you see, we have the inertia, elbow inertia out there, which is the elbow graph that you want to build. That is the helper function. And then we have it as a plot, the plot that we want to build, a function for that as well. So we load the iris data set yet again, and we want to see how does that work. What we're going to do is we're going to look at the standardized version of this data. Now, why the standard scaler is coming into the picture is because let's say I have 4 different features in a data set, and then all those features have different varied ranges. That is, there might be a feature which is very compact in the minimum and the maximum value. There's a feature that has values which are very far apart. Given this difference in the ranges that we have, the entire cluster is going to change the entire dynamics if we put it out there. So we use a simple standard scalar function out there so that we standardize all those values to a plane wherein all those features are in the same uh, plot item, plot, or let's say same dimension out there, or same range is what we can say. So for example, let's say different features are there in this iris data set. Let's say one feature has a distinct attribute in terms of ranging from -1 to 10 out there. But there might be another feature out there which is ranging from 200 to 1000. That is not a fair differentiation or a fair comparison, right? That is why we standardize all of that to bring that down to a certain value so that all of them are comparable in the same space that we're talking about. So we have the standard scalar function out there utilizing the library that we're working with. We have already loaded the data as you see here. Now our job is to standardize those data. How we're going to do is that we're going to first specify the scalar, which is going to be the standard scalar. We have different scalars as well, but for this scope, we're talking about the standard scalar. And then we want to determine the standardized data. Let's say my data was X, and then now I have the standardized data as XZ, which is basically going to be the scalar. And then I'm going to fit it to the scalar that I have. So we use this attribute fit transform. And then I'm going to apply my data to it. I'll start running this from the above. Now, once that is done, what we're going to do is, here again, we have an example of k is equals to 3, but let's say we're running the k-means algorithm, right? So how we're going to do is we're just going to call the k-means function out there, which is through the library. And then I want the clusters to be is equals to k. And then what can be the minimum and the maximum value is 1 and 10. So how can I determine that? I can determine it by the n init value. And then yet again, I want the max iterations to not go beyond 300. So I specify max iterations as 300. And here I'm going to put a seed value to the random state, which is basically 0. Here's a typo. We need capital M here in k-means. Now to derive the labels for it, we have the fit predict function out here. We're just going to put the k-means and fit it to the values that we want and get the labels. So once I run this, I'll get the similar graph again. But the only difference here is that I'm using a pre-built functionality in a library and not hard coding it through a function that we built together. So here as well, the k is equals to 3 is chosen because it looks as the final elbow point and is the best number of clusters for the data that we are working with. And it also talks about the different centroid standardized feature space. If we run this more, we're going to get the same value in terms of 3 different clusters assigned with particular centroids. Okay, is everybody good till here? Okay, let's just circle back to what we were discussing. Now, k-means clustering is done. In terms of a data that is given to us, k-means clustering is an unsupervised algorithm that helps us make clusters out of those data sets. And those clusters essentially mean something in terms of the derivation analysis that we're doing. Next up, what I'm going to talk about is the curse of dimensionality. What is the curse of dimensionality is, let's understand by this simple picture that I have here. I have 10 data points on a straight line. These 10 data points look compact enough, right? Let's say I project these data points into a 2D space. Now they're a little sparse. What if I put that out in a three-dimensional space? The entire scope changes, right? They're very sparse now. So as the dimensions are growing, the space that is out there is expanding exponentially. So compare this to a data set out there. Let's say we have n number of features. How does that completely transform the way we are doing the analysis? And one thing that we need to realize before getting into the solution of dealing with all these dimensions and how can we not have these useless or useful dimensions is, how does the entire scope changes if we have more dimensions out there? One of the reason is sparsity. If the distance measures becomes less meaningful, as the distance increases, the entire scope becomes less meaningful. What it does is that as we have more dimensions, the computational cost also increases because we are running the same thing again and again to reach towards the goal that we are working towards. And then finally, overfitting is also a possibility, wherein the model might just learn from the irrelevant features, and what we want it to learn is not essentially learned from the model. So these are the consequences that we want to prevent. And how do we prevent it? We prevent it by a common technique called principal component analysis. The entire base of principal component analysis is to help you reduce the number of features. Remember the way we were talking about a data set has 100 features, but sorry, a data set has 50 features, but only 20 of them are useful to me. Why would I not just use those 20 and work out my analysis? So PCA, what it does is it helps you reduce those number of features in a particular data set that I have at hand. And what it does is in that process, it just keeps the most important information. So it's intelligent enough to capture the right features out there. How does that happen? It just changes your entire original feature space into a new feature space. How does that do it? It does through the linear algebra methods that are out there, and it transforms all the data features that you are using in a particular data set, and it projects to a new feature space that it calculates, which are called the principal components. And what linear algebra techniques it uses is stuff like eigenvalues and eigenvectors, if you have heard of it. And what it does is that it computes them to generate a covariance matrix out there. Now, how do we go towards putting together PCA for a particular data set out there? And I know this might be overwhelming for a lot of people because maths is coming into the picture now, but just stop me where you want me to answer any questions. Now, what is happening at the step one is that we first want to start from standardizing the data. What is happening here is that the similar case that we talked in K-means, the data could be varied enough. Let's say we have a data at hand wherein salary is in dollars, age is in numbers, height and weight have different dimensions. How do we just compare all of this together? We do it by standardization. We bring all those values to a uh, certain space out there, and we want them to be at a particular similar plane so that the comparison is fair. It's not partial towards any feature. And the simple formula that we use here is x minus mu upon sigma, where mu is the mean of independent features and sigma is the standard deviation of the independent features, which are calculated by the usual methods that we have talked about in the previous sessions. Once the standard deviation is calculated, we now work towards calculating the covariance metrics. Now, how do covariance metrics uh, kind of play picture here, and what is the essence of having it? What does covariance actually mean? Covariance is simple measure to see how two features are related to each other in a particular space. So what happens here is that we have an increase factor or a decrease factor. Now, if they are highly correlated, the tendency of having them project towards one direction increases, right? They might work in the similar fashion. And then let's say if they have a very different covariance very minute covariance, they just not work in the same direction. It's just totally opposite to the what case we're talking about. So what we're going to do is we're going to find the covariance matrix. The simple formula that we utilize for covariance finding is, sorry, my bad, is represented here. So we find the covariance between two distinct points out there, and then for each data point we do that, and for all the features out there we do that. So we generate a matrix out of it. So let's say I have a data of about 4 attributes or 4 features. I'm going to generate a 4x4 covariance matrix for it, just to see how distinctly each feature impacts each sample or each particular case out there. So one thing that I want to mention here is that the value that we may get is that a positive result, what it means is that they increase together, as we talked about. However, a negative result is very obvious that if one is going up, the other might go down. That is how the different sign values work in terms of the covariance matrix that we're putting together. Step 3 is to find the principal components. How do we do that? We do that by eigenvalues and eigenvectors. So the directions in terms of, let's see, if one is going up, the other is going down. If one is increasing, the other is decreasing. That comes from the eigenvectors of the covariance matrix. And their importance in terms of how much impact each feature is making comes from the eigenvalues out there. How we compute it, I think we've seen it in the previous sessions. If I get into the details of it right now, it is going to be really messy. But what I want you to understand here is that what PCA does is that it is going to identify different axes, principal component 1, which is the first principal component, or the second principal component. How does that kind of differ from each other? If you can see, first principal component out there, the direction of the maximum variance in terms of how mostly spread the entire feature space looks like. Or the second principal component, which is what is the next best direction to the first principal component that we have, which is usually orthogonal that we talk about. But that is how we look towards it. And how do we do the math for it? We have a simple function here, ax is equals to lambda x, which essentially means that for any PCA, any special eigenvector, the direction and all of it is determined by these calculations out there, and this formula out there, and the directions, as I said, come from the eigenvectors, and the importance is measured by the eigenvalues. Now the next step is, let's say we have calculated all of this. We want to finalize what are the top directions and how they transform data. So let's say after calculating the eigenvectors and their corresponding eigenvalues out there, what PCA does is that it ranks all of those, and then we select the top K components out of it. Let's say the components that capture most of the variance, 95% or more. That is, they basically determine how the entire scope of the analysis looks like. And then what we do is we finally create our own reduced data set from all those features that are out there. And we just use the original top K components that we have utilized. So if you see the image here on your screen, we have a simple graph wherein we have 2 features. One is radius and the other is data. The radius is measured by the radius, and the axis are represented by the black axis out there. The radius and the area, my bad. Yeah. And then PCA, what it does is that it identifies 2 new directions. PC1, if you can see, and then PC2, if you can see, which are the principal components of the reduced data that we have found. Now, these 2 axes are the rotated versions of the original ones that we're talking about. So we started off with the original axis, and now we're talking about the rotated axis. So PC1, if you see, captures the maximum variance in the data. That essentially means that it is holding most of the information. While PC2, it captures the remaining variance out there and is perpendicular to PC1. That is orthogonal to PC1. So the spread of data is much wider along the PC1 concept, and that what we compare to PC2, that is pretty much evident out there. So why, and entirely this is why PC1 is kind of utilized for dimensionality reduction for this particular case that we're talking about. And entirely what happens is that the scope is shifted, and now we have the best attributes out there that are used in the analysis. Let's circle back to coding now. Yes.
If you had unlimited computational power, would you still do this stuff?
Yeah. Why do we do this is not just because we want to reduce the computational step, but it's also because by this particular analysis that we do, we capture the most essential features out there. That is something that you're going to see in the coding that we're also going to do. That it does not matter if 100 features are out there, all 100 need to be included in the analysis. Some of them might just be contributing nothing, and we might just utilize the other ones, which are better in terms of the final goal that we are reaching at.
Like you saw the equation thing was 300, you can even put in 10,000. And you can still compute and compute and compute. It's better if you, retrieve the data initially and then pass it to the model, rather than passing the whole data to the model, letting the model determine like what is important. Makes sense. Thank you.
Okay. Circling back, let's just implement PCA from scratch. And then just as we saw for k-means, we have a pre-built thing for PCA as well. So to look at it, let's say I have a dummy data. I have steps, I have resting heart rate, I have sleeping hours, I have age, and I'm just trying to determine if the person is active or not. So there's a condition that I've put out here is that if steps are greater than 9,000 or if the resting heart rate is less than 60 and the sleep hours are greater than 7.5 hours, just put that person as an active person. So what we're doing here is that we are utilizing these features to determine if a person is active or not. So we have X as the features, which is steps, resting hour, sleep hours, and age, resting heart rate, and not resting hour, yeah. And then Y as if the person is active or not. So we saw how we standardize the data first in PCA, right? And let's just work towards that. So we have the data out there. We'll just implement that. We'll also create a data frame of this particular data that we have. We're going to define the person is active or non-active basis the condition that we have. We have split the data in terms of what we want in terms of the analysis and the projection as well. Next up is the standardization. How do we do that? So mu was the mean, right? So what we do is simply we just take the entire data, which is X, and we call the mean for it. This is how the data looks like. Okay. Now, given this data, we're calculating the mu, which is the mean, right? So we just simply put X dot mean. We put X is equals to 0. And then we put keep dimensions is equals to 3. Then we had another thing in that Z function that we were talking about, the standardization function, as sigma, which is the standard deviation. How do we calculate that? We simply put X as standard deviation and then follow a similar thing here as well. Once this is done, we have a step to ensure that at no instance, the division in terms of the score that we're calculating, at no instance the division happens by 0, because then the entire thing will not fall into the place that we want to have. That is something that we don't want to happen. So now next up, I had X. Now I'll work towards having the standardized X, which is basically the same function that we talked about in the slide. and then we'll divide it by sigma. I'll run this function. Once standardization is done, we work towards getting the covariance matrix. And that is pretty simple with the NumPy feature that we have. So just explicitly what we can do is we can write here np dot covariance, which is a functionality that we have to calculate the covariance matrix. And then what we can do is we have the centered data out here. We'll call that centered data. And then we have row variable is equals to false, such that there should be a feature out there in all of those. So covariance matrix is done. Then we do the eigen decomposition because it's a symmetric matrix. We can easily do it through the functionalities that we have. Then we sort them for the calculation that we have to do under PCA. And then what we do simply is that project that into the feature space that we're looking at. What entirely is the end goal is to look at the variance ratio. How do we look at that variance ratio? Is simply by taking the eigenvalues and then dividing it by the sum of it. Once this is done, and if you run the next cell, it is going to give you how different the two component features look like. So pretty evidently, PC1 is kind of the most contributing out there, and it entirely holds the essence of what we are trying to derive out of this data set. And this is another plot that I put together for you guys to look at how PC1 and PC2 differ on the lifestyle data that we were talking about. So what is happening here is that let's just see the eigenvalues. If you see 4.17, 0.0672, 0.0132, and 0.008, it is pretty obvious that I'll possibly choose the first one out there because it is the component that is holding the most essence out there for the calculation that I have to do. And then the explained variance ratio that I was talking about, 97% is what can be easily done with the PC1 that I'm working with. So why would I just utilize the other features and take them into the consideration for the analysis that I'm doing? And then I have a principal component matrix out there, which is how does each feature kind of vary when we take into the consideration the PC1, PC2, PC3, PC4. So we have different values for it. Value is the impact that it causes, and the sign gives the direction. So if one goes up, the other goes down, and that is entirely how the entire scope changes. So this is how we were doing it from the scratch version. But let's just look at the core functionality version in terms of taking it from a library. So we have the similar data again. We are doing the same job, but you would now see how the entire computation and calculation just reduced to just one call out there. So I'm also scaling here. I just called the standard scaler out there instead of doing the scaling myself, which is the standard scaler does the similar job of scaling out there that we were doing by calculating the score. What I have to just do here is just call the function out there. So PCA is actually under the sklearn library that we're talking about, the scikit-learn library. And then I'm specifying the components as 2. I just do this and then I just have to fit it to the data that I have. So I had the scaled data. I'll just apply PCA to it. The results are obviously going to be the same ones as we saw earlier. But the core idea is to tell you how it can be done easily with the help of the library and the functionalities that are out there. And then again, the similar graph, that the first component that we talked about kind of has the entire essence for the analysis that we're doing. Okay, this was about principal component analysis. That is one technique, but there's a mathematical engine behind how this PCA happens. And that engine is basically called singular value decomposition. It has even more math around it. So we'll try to take it slow and we'll try to understand why and how does that happen. So what happens in SVD is that it is first of all, let's understand what it is. So it is basically like a fundamental matrix factorization technique, which decomposes any matrix into three distinct matrices. And what happens is that it becomes more meaningful that day. The, why does it become more meaningful is because it has one part that tells you about the general preferences, one part about how important the features are, and the other how similar the features are. It is pretty much utilized in the recommender system out there, or the user items metrics that we built for kind of seeing how a particular item in user transaction looks like, interaction looks like. And what we're doing here is that we are taking these all matrices and decomposing it into three distinct metrics. So one part of it is, let's say we are talking about any metric, any data out there, and it is telling you how about the people, what are their general preferences. And the next part, which is sigma, it tells you how important each factor is. That is, for a data that has movie ratings or a user item rating, how much each rating matters. And then finally, we have a V transpose metric, which is how the products vary, how similar they are, how apart they are from the scope that we're looking at. And mathematically, for any given a m cross n data that we have, or the matrix that we have, we determine SVD by this simple mathematical formula out there that is at the bottom. To have an easy breather of how this actually works, I've put together this simple example for you guys. Let's say we have this data and we're talking about a user item interaction. We have three distinct users, we have two distinct items, and we have ratings for them. So what do these matrices that we're going to devise from the SVD meaning for this particular data? So we have the first part as U, which is kind of the way it is going to tell you about the people, how the people like the entire item that we're talking about. And then the next is how important these ratings are for the different people out there. And then finally, how similar these items are in the scope to each other, so that if an item is closely related to another, there's a high tendency that a person who likes item A might also like item 2. That is the entire essence that we're working towards here. So this is the calculation. It has a lot more mathematics behind it, but if we get into the details of it, it is going to be a little messy. So let's just look at from a coding perspective. What happens here is, let's just go back to we'll utilize the same data that we were utilizing so far, the active lifestyle data set. I'm going to scale the data again. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to utilize the SVD from the library that are out there. So what I'm going to basically do is just, yes, so I'll call the numpy. And I'll utilize SVD. I'll utilize the scaled data set. And then I have an attribute called full matrices is equals to false. Once done, we're going to look at the shapes of this. So the first matrix out there is 16,4. We have four distinct features. We have the singular values out there for these. And what we're also looking at is the V transpose shape, which is the 4x4 matrix. Now, as I said, this is closely related to PCA. What we're going to do is we're going to establish a relationship, and then we're also going to calculate the variance ratio as we did in PCA. The results are going to look similar here, but the core ideology is to understand how SVD kind of channelizes the engine behind PCA. So these values, as you might be looking at, it is very similar to what we looked at in the previous PCA analysis that we did. And that entirely tells us that there are distinct calculations to it, but both are projecting towards the dimensionality reduction goal that we have. Similarly, if you see in terms of the data set, the PC1, PC2, yet again, we see PC1 as the most contributing, and the 2D projection also looks the similar. And then I have a reconstruction error using two components that is about, it's just about 0.07, which is like well above 95%. It's kind of doing a good job of depicting and analyzing what my data looks like and reducing the entire dimension for the analysis that we want to do. This is entirely about the principal component reduction that we have. Yeah, I think that is all that I have from my end. I also want to make this announcement out there. Tomorrow we have another event, which is just a breather event in terms of having a chill time with all the technical people out there, talk about maybe tech stuff or maybe not. But the entire essence is to have a breather and not just work towards just doing all of this all together. So tomorrow this is going to happen. It is happening at the Vortex Apartments. It is a barbecue that we have put together. It is in collaboration with Soda, Wix, and GDSE. So a lot of people are going to be there. It is good for you to network as well. So I hope to see you all there then. Okay, the food is outside.